done with what confines its operation in us to ours and plays itself out in ours in a considerable time. Some in half a year, others in half a lifetime, according to the speed and strength with which they digest and change their material. Indeed, I could think of sluggish, hesitating races, which even in our rapidly moving Europe would require half a century ere they could surmount such atavistic attacks of patriotism and soil attachment, and return once more to reason, that is to say, to good Europeanism. And while digressing on this possibility, I happened to become an ear witness of a conversation between two old patriots. They were evidently both hard of hearing and consequently spoke all the louder. He has as much and knows as much philosophy as a peasant or a corpse student, said the one. He is still innocent, but what does that matter nowadays? It is the age of the masses. They lie on their belly before everything that is massive, and so also in politics. A statesman who rears up for them a new Tower of Babel, some monstrosity of empire and power they call great. What does it matter that we more prudent and conservative ones do not meanwhile give up the old belief that it is only the great thought that gives greatness to an action or affair? Supposing a statesman were to bring his people into the position of being obliged henceforth to practice high politics, for which they were by nature badly endowed and prepared, so that they would have to sacrifice their old and reliable virtues out of love to a new and doubtful mediocrity. Supposing a statesman were to condemn his people generally to practice politics, when they have hitherto had something better to do and think about, and when in the depths of their souls they have been able to free themselves from a prudent loathing of the restlessness, emptiness, and noisy wranglings of the essentially politics-practicing nations. Supposing such a statesman were to stimulate the slumbering passions and avidities of his people, were to make a stigma out of their former diffidence and delight in aloofness, an offense out of their exoticism and hidden permanency, were to depreciate their most radical proclivities, subvert their consciences, make their minds narrow, and their tastes national. What? A statesman who should do all this, which his people would have to do penance for throughout their whole future, if they had a future. Such a statesman would be great, would he? Undoubtedly, replied the other old patriot vehemently. Otherwise he could not have done it. It was mad, perhaps, to wish such a thing, but perhaps everything great has been just as mad at its commencement. Misuse of words, cried his interlocutor, contradictorily. Strong, 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 and mad, not great. The old men had obviously become heated as they thus shouted their truths in each other's faces. But I, in my happiness and apartness, considered how soon a stronger one may become master of the strong. And also that there is a compensation for the intellectual superficializing of a nation, namely, in the deepening of another. Whether we call it civilization, or humanizing, or progress, which now distinguishes the European, whether we call it simply, without praise or blame, by the political formula, the democratic movement in Europe, behind all the moral and political foregrounds pointed to by such formulas, an immense physiological process goes on, which is ever extending the process of the assimilation of Europeans. Their increasing detachment from the conditions under which climatically and hereditarily united races originate, their increasing independence of every definite milieu that for centuries would fain inscribe itself with equal demands on soul and body. That is to say, the slow emergence of an essentially supranational and nomadic species of man, who possesses, physiologically speaking, a maximum of the art and power of adaptation as his typical distinction. This process of the evolving European, which can be retarded in its tempo by great relapses, but will perhaps just gain and grow thereby in vehemence and depth, the still raging storm and stress of national sentiment pertains to it, and also the anarchism which is appearing at present. This process will probably arrive at results on which its naive propagators and panegyrists, the apostles of modern ideas, would least care to reckon. The same new conditions under which on an average a leveling and mediocrizing of man will take place, a useful, industrious, variously serviceable, and clever gregarious man, are in the highest degree suitable to give rise to exceptional men of the most dangerous and attractive qualities. For while the capacity for adaptation, which is every day trying changing conditions, and begins a new work with every generation, almost with every decade, makes the powerfulness of the type impossible, while the collective impression of such future Europeans will probably be that of numerous, talkative, weak-willed, and very handy workmen who require a master, a commander, as they require their daily bread, while therefore the democratizing of Europe will tend to the production of a type prepared for slavery in the most subtle sense of the term. The strong man will necessarily in individual and exceptional cases become stronger and richer than he has perhaps ever been before, owing to the unprejudiceedness of his schooling, owing to the immense variety of practice, art, and disguise. I mean to say that the democratizing of Europe is at the same time an involuntary arrangement for the rearing of tyrants, taking the word in all its meanings, even in its most spiritual sense. I hear with pleasure that our sun is moving rapidly towards the constellation Hercules, and I hope that the men on this earth will do like the sun, and we foremost, we good Europeans. There was a time when it was customary to call Germans deep by way of distinction. But now that the most successful type of new Germanism is covetous of quite other honors and perhaps misses smartness in all that has depth, it is almost opportune and patriotic to doubt whether we did not formally deceive ourselves with that commendation. In short, whether German depth is not at bottom something different and worse, and something from which, thank God, we are on the point of successfully ridding ourselves. Let us try, then, to relearn with regard to German depth. The only thing necessary for the purpose is a little vivisection of the German soul. The German soul is above all manifold, varied in its source, aggregated and superimposed, rather than actually built. This is owing to its origin. A German who would embolden himself to assert, "Two souls, alas, dwell in my breast," would make a bad guess at the truth, or, more correctly, he would come far short of the truth about the number of souls. As a people made up of the most extraordinary mixing and mingling of races, perhaps even with the preponderance of the pre-Aryan element as the people of the center in every sense of the term. The Germans are more intangible, more ample, more contradictory, more unknown, more incalculable, more surprising, and even more terrifying than other peoples are to themselves. They escape definition and are thereby alone the despair of the French. It is characteristic of the Germans that the question, "What is German?" never dies out among them. Kotzebue certainly knew his Germans well enough. "We are known," they cried jubilantly to him. But Sand also thought he knew them. Jean Paul knew what he was doing when he declared himself incensed at Ficht's lying but patriotic flatteries and exaggerations. But is it probable that Goethe thought differently about Germans from Jean Paul, even though he acknowledged him to be right with regard to Fichte? It is a question what Goethe really thought about the Germans. But about many things around him he never spoke explicitly, and all his life he knew how to keep an astute silence. Probably he had good reason for it. It is certain that it was not the wars of independence that made him look up more joyfully, any more than it was the French Revolution, the event on account of which he reconstructed his Faust. And indeed the whole problem of man was the appearance of Napoleon. There are words of Goethe in which he condemns with impatient severity, as from a foreign land, that which Germans take pride in. He once defined the famous German turn of mind as indulgent towards its own and others' weaknesses. Was he wrong? It is characteristic of Germans that one is seldom entirely wrong about them. The German soul has passages and galleries in it. There are caves, hiding places, and dungeons therein. Its disorder has much of the charm of the mysterious. The German is well acquainted with the bypaths to chaos. And as everything loves its symbol, so the German loves the clouds and all that is obscure, evolving, crepuscular, damp, and shrouded. It seems to him that everything uncertain, undeveloped, self-displacing, and growing is deep. The German himself does not exist. He is becoming. He is developing himself. Development is therefore the essentially German discovery and hit in the great domain of philosophical formulas. A ruling idea which, together with German beer and German music, is laboring to Germanize all Europe. Foreigners are astonished and attracted by the riddles which the conflicting nature at the basis of the German soul propounds to them. Riddles with Hegel systemized and Richard Wagner has in the end set to music. Good-natured and spiteful. Such a juxtaposition, preposterous in the case of every other people, is unfortunately only too often justified in Germany. One has only to live for a while among Swabians to know this. The clumsiness of the German scholar and his social distastefulness agree alarmingly well with his physical rope dancing and nimble boldness, of which all the gods have learnt to be afraid. If anyone wishes to see the German soul demonstrated ad oculus, let him only look at German taste, at German arts and manners, what boorish indifference to taste. How the noblest and the commonest stand there in juxtaposition. How disorderly and how rich is the whole constitution of this soul. The German drags at his soul. He drags at everything he experiences. He digests his events badly. He never gets done with them. And German depth is often only a difficult, hesitating digestion. And just as all chronic invalids, all dyspeptics like what is convenient. So the German loves frankness and honesty. It is so convenient to be frank and honest. This confidingness, this complacence, this slowing the cards of German honesty is probably the most dangerous and most successful disguise which the German is up to nowadays. It is his proper Mephistophelian art. With this, he can still achieve much. The German lets himself go, and thereby gazes with faithful, blue, empty German eyes, and other countries immediately confound him tearful, and his belief in the South can still appeal to something left in us. Sometime or other it will be over with it. Sometime or other it will be over with it. But who can doubt that it will be over still sooner with the intelligence and taste for Beethoven? For he was only the last echo of a break and transition in style, and not, like Mozart, the last echo of a great European taste which had existed for centuries. Beethoven is the intermediate event between an old mellow soul that is constantly breaking down and a future over-young soul that is always coming. There is spread over his music the twilight of eternal loss and eternal extravagant hope, the same light in which Europe was bathed when it dreamed with Rousseau, when it danced round the tree of liberty of the Revolution, and finally almost fell down in adoration before Napoleon. But how rapidly does this very sentiment now pale? How difficult nowadays is even the apprehension of this sentiment? How strangely does the language of Rousseau, Schiller, Shelley, and Biron sound to our ear, in whom collectively the same fate of Europe was able to speak, which knew how to sing in Beethoven. Whatever German music came afterwards belongs to Romanticism, that is to say, a movement which, historically considered, was still shorter, more fleeting, and more superficial than that great interlude, the transition of Europe from Rousseau to Napoleon, and to the rise of democracy. Weber. But what do we care nowadays for Freischütz and Oberon, or Marschner's Hans Healing and Vampire, or even Wagner's Tannhauser? That is extinct, although not yet forgotten music. This whole music of Romanticism, besides, was not noble enough, was not musical enough to maintain its position anywhere but in the theater and before the masses. From the beginning, it was second-rate music, which was little thought of by genuine musicians. It was different with Felix Mendelssohn, that halcyon master, who on account of his lighter, purer, happier soul, quickly acquired admiration, and was equally quickly forgotten as the beautiful episode of German music. But with regard to Robert Schumann, who took things seriously and has been taken seriously from the first, he was the last that founded a school. Do we not now regard it as a satisfaction, a relief, a deliverance that this very romanticism of Schumann's has been surmounted? Schumann fleeing into the Saxon Switzerland of his soul, with a half-Werther-like, half-Jean-Paul-like nature, assuredly not like Beethoven, assuredly not like Biron. His Manfred music is a mistake and a misunderstanding to the extent of injustice. Schumann, with his taste, which was fundamentally a petty taste, that is to say, a dangerous propensity, doubly dangerous among Germans, for quiet lyricism and intoxication of the feelings. going constantly apart, timidly withdrawing and retiring, a noble weakling who revelled in nothing but anonymous joy and sorrow. From the beginning, a sort of girl and noli me tangere. This Schumann was already merely a German event in music, and no longer a European event, as Beethoven had been. As in a still greater degree, Mozart had been. With Schumann, German music was threatened with its greatest danger, that of losing the voice for the soul of Europe and sinking into a merely national affair. What a torture are books written in German to a reader who has a third ear. How indignantly he stands beside the slowly turning swamp of sounds without tune and rhythms, without dance, which Germans call a book. And even the German who reads books, how lazily, how reluctantly, how badly he reads. How many Germans know and consider it obligatory to know that there is art in every good sentence? Art which must be divined if the sentence is to be understood. If there is a misunderstanding about its tempo, for instance, the sentence itself is misunderstood. That one must not be doubtful about the rhythm determining syllables, that one should feel the breaking of the too rigid symmetry as intentional and as a charm, that one should lend a fine and patient ear to every staccato and every rubato, that one should divine the sense in the sequence of the vowels and diphthongs, and how delicately and richly they can be tinted and retinted in order of their arrangement, who among book-reading Germans is complacent enough to recognize such duties and requirements, and to listen to so much art and intention in language. After all, one just has no ear for it, and so the most marked contrast of style are not heard, and the most delicate artistry is, as it were, squandered on the deaf. These were my thoughts when I noticed how clumsily and unintuitively two masters in the art of prose writing have been confounded. One, whose words drop down hesitatingly and coldly, as from the roof of a damp cave. He counts on their dull sound and echo. And another, who manipulates his language like a flexible sword, and from his arm down to his toes feels the dangerous bliss of the quivering, over-sharp blade, which wishes to bite, hiss, and cut. How little the German style has to do with harmony and with the ear is shown by the fact that precisely our good musicians themselves write badly. The German does not read aloud. He does not read for the ear, but only with his eyes. He has put his ears away in the drawer for the time. In antiquity, when a man read, which was seldom enough, he read something to himself, and in a loud voice. They were surprised when anyone read silently, and sought secretly the reason of it. In a loud voice, that is to say, with all the swellings, inflections, and variations of key and changes of tempo, in which the ancient public world took delight. The laws of the written style were then the same as those of the spoken style, and these laws depended partly on the surprising development and refined requirements of the ear and larynx, partly on the strength, endurance, and power of ancient lungs. In the ancient sense, a period is above all a psychological whole, inasmuch as it is comprised in one breath. Such periods as occur in Demosthenes and Cicero, swelling twice and sinking twice, and all in one breath, were pleasures to the men of antiquity, who knew by their own schooling how to appreciate the virtue therein, the rareness and the difficulty in the deliverance of such a period. We, have really no right to the big period, we modern men, who are short of breath in every sense. Those ancients, indeed, were all of them dilettanti in speaking, consequently connoisseurs, consequently critics. They thus brought their orators to the highest pitch. In the same manner as in the last century, when all Italian ladies and gentlemen knew how to sing, the virtuoship of song, and with it also the art of melody, reached its elevation. In Germany, however, until quite recently, when a kind of platform eloquence began shyly and awkwardly enough to flutter its young wings, there was, properly speaking, only one kind of public and approximately artistical discourse. That delivered from the pulpit. The preacher was the only one in Germany who knew the weight of a syllable or a word, in what manner a sentence strikes, springs, rushes, flows, and comes to a close. He alone had a conscience in his ears, often enough a bad conscience, for reasons are not lacking why proficiency in oratory should be especially seldom attained by a German, or almost always too late. The masterpiece of German prose is therefore, with good reason, the masterpiece of its greatest preacher. The Bible has hitherto been the best German book. Compared with Luther's Bible, almost everything else is merely literature, something which has not grown in Germany, and therefore has not taken and does not take root in German hearts, as the Bible has done. There are two kinds of geniuses, one which above all engenders and seeks to engender, and another which willingly lets itself be fructified and brings forth. And similarly, among the gifted nations, there are those on whom the woman's problem of pregnancy has devolved, and the secret task of forming, maturing, and perfecting. The Greeks, for instance, were a nation of this kind, and so are the French, and others which have to fructify and become the cause of new modes of life, like the Jews, the Romans, and, in all modesty, be it asked, like the Germans? Nations tortured and enraptured by unknown fevers and irresistibly forced out of themselves, amorous and longing for foreign races, for such as let themselves be fructified, and withal imperious, like everything, conscious of being full of generative force, and consequently empowered by the grace of God. These two kinds of geniuses seek each other, like man and woman, but they also misunderstand each other, like man and woman. Every nation has its own tartuffery, and calls that its virtue. One does not know, cannot know, the best that is in one. What Europe owes to the Jews? Many things, good and bad, and above all, one thing of the nature both of the best and the worst. The grand style and morality, the fearfulness and majesty of infinite demands, of infinite significations, the whole romanticism and sublimity of moral questionableness, and consequently just the most attractive, ensnaring, and exquisite element in those iridescences and allurements to life, in the aftersheen of which the sky of our European culture, its evening sky, now glows, perhaps glows out. For this, we artists among the spectators and philosophers are grateful to the Jews. It must be taken into the bargain, if various clouds and disturbances, in short, slight attacks of stupidity, pass over the spirit of a people that suffers and wants to suffer from national nervous fever and political ambition. For instance, among present-day Germans, there is alternately the anti-French folly, the anti-Semitic folly, the anti-Polish folly, the Christian romantic folly, the Wagnerian folly, the Teutonic folly, the Russian folly. Just look at those poor historians, the Sibyls and Trishaks, and their closely bandaged heads, and whatever else these little obscurations of the German spirit and conscience may be called. May it be forgiven me that I, too, when on a short daring sojourn on very infected ground, did not remain wholly exempt from the disease, but like everyone else, began to entertain thoughts about matters which did not concern me. The first symptom of political infection. About the Jews, for instance, listen to the following. I have never, yet, met a German who was favorably inclined to the Jews, and however decided the repudiation of actual anti-Semitism may be on the part of all prudent and political men. This prudence and policy is not perhaps directed against the nature of the sentiment itself, but only against its dangerous excess, and especially against the distasteful and infamous expression of this excess of sentiment. On this point, we must not deceive ourselves that Germany has amply sufficient Jews, that the German stomach, the German blood, has difficulty and will long have difficulty in disposing only of this quantity of Jew as the Italian, the Frenchman, and the Englishman have done by means of a stronger digestion. That is the unmistakable declaration and language of a general instinct, to which one must listen and according to which one must act. Let no more Jews come in, and shut the doors, especially towards the east, also towards Austria. Thus commands the instinct of a people whose nature is still feeble and uncertain, so that it could be easily wiped out, easily extinguished by a stronger race. The Jews, however, are beyond all doubt the strongest, toughest, and purest race at present living in Europe. They know how to succeed even under the worst conditions, in fact, better than under favorable ones, by means of virtues of some sort, which one would like nowadays to label as vices, owing above all to a resolute faith which does not need to be ashamed before modern ideas. They alter only when they do alter, in the